We know the media like a good attention-grabbing headline, but they are not wrong when they talk about the rental crisis of 2022.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You, of course, know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're talking about rentals. What has led to the current lack of supply and what are some of the options that we have to fix the problem? But before we get to that, there's a very special house behind you today, Megan. One of
Gorgeous,
my faves.
And oh God, look at it. It's magnificent. It's the iconic Opera House. I know it's not technically a house, but I found this 2021 image of 2016, I think it was, image in honor of World Oceans Day, and it's called the Kingdom of Coral. It's part of a series of artworks which celebrate the work of marine conservationist Valerie Taylor. Now, given how much I love to scuba dive and share the underwater world with those beautiful creatures, I thought it was just stunning, just stunning.
Oh.
But let's talk about the real issue. How hard is it to find a house to rent at the moment, Veronica?
Well, before you do that, vivid is when the Sydney the Sydney Opera House comes alive, really. In recent years, you know, we've had some amazing images. Those sails transformed to some of the most incredible images. And it's vivid as we're recording, but I've been locked up with COVID, so I haven't been able to get out and see it.
Oh, wow. I think one of my favourite marine photographers, Craig Parry, I think he had one in the last couple of days, but I couldn't actually find, go back to a source image. So hopefully we'll see that soon.
I'll have to keep an eye out. Hopefully I'll get let out and I'll be able to rug up and go out and check it out. It's pretty magic.
Be released.
Yeah. All right. I'm actually technically, I'm out of the 7 days, but I still got symptoms and I'm not willing to inflict them on other people. And so I'm staying home.
You did well to avoid it this long anyway. Off track we
I
get.
know. Let's talk about the real issue, as you were saying, how hard it is to find a house to rent at the moment. And this rental crisis is real. And you actually flagged it, I think, before anyone else that I came across. I think it probably bit in Brisbane, probably maybe first in the country.
Yeah. It was actually leading into COVID. We were starting to see it be a little bit of a problem, not a huge amount. And of course, we manage a number of properties up here in partnership with another firm, but it was what we were starting to see, and we're going to go into this, how did this all come about? We were starting to see a decrease in the number of investors in the market. And that was as a result of some things that happened, but all of the writing was on the wall from my point of view. So, I don't necessarily look at stats. I'm very much about behaviour and property and supply and demand. So I look at all of those aspects much more than what are the stats doing and, what does it tell us? Because the stats are the result of the behaviour, not the lead indicator of the behaviour. So that's much more where I like to look. And we're starting to see some indicators pre-COVID. COVID then, messed everything up. Anything that we could have thought was happening in any market was turned upside down. But coming out of it, Let's talk about that, because I want everyone to understand how we've got to this point of having a rental crisis, because it isn't one part of the picture, the greater picture that's caused it. There are many, many things that have gone into it, and there are so many lessons that we need to learn. And I think that even individuals at the tenant level need to understand these factors to understand why just wanting something for you, which is an affordable house to live in, there's so much to go into actually making that happen.
So in retrospect, of course, in hindsight, we understand a lot of things better than we do understand them at the time that they're happening. And certainly I think all the leading indicators that might have given anybody a clue to this rental crisis are probably all these little tiny individual things that nobody really stitched together. And like you say, COVID has brought things to a head. Unexpected challenges, poor decisions, regulatory, legislative, monetary, personal decisions at a macro level, right down to individual personal levels, trace back to before 2017 even, because of course that's when, actually 2016, when APRA started tightening up investor lending. So you got, and you can't blame one side of politics either. This is just
because we've had multi-parties in this period of time, and we've had elections where we could have changed parties.
In different states, and there's been state legislation and changes to tenants' rights, and not to say that tenants shouldn't have rights, they damn right should, but there's always the balance. And then you've got public housing. There's been a long-term decrease in government investment in public housing, and so that's putting more pressure on the private rental market, etc.
Let's break it down. Let's have a look at it. Let's set the scene. So this is not a media beat up. So we often jump on, headlines and say, yes, what a load of, what, but it's not a media beat up, and it's not an attempt by property managers to make more money. And I think it's really important that we differentiate, because people are looking to blame, and the poor buggers that manage the properties are often put in the middle of it. But let's set the scene. So supply and demand, the basis of economics. There are about 10 million households in Australia. 32% of those households rent. So that's about 2.6 million households that rent. Now, 3.7% of those are public housing, so your housing commission and so forth. That's about 300,000 households that rent from the government in some form, whether it's state or federal. So that means that about 26% of the rental pool is actually provided by private landlords. That's 2.1 million households that rent from people who make a decision to invest in residential property. So let's look at supply, because that's an important factor. When you've got a population that's growing and you need more households, where's the supply going to come from? Now, that's the number of private rentals available at any one time. Don't think about vacancy rate. That's flashed all over the place. It's low. Let's just look at how many are available in the pool to supply houses to people who want to live in them at any one time. So leading up to 2018, the number of privately owned rentals was actually trending up. So there was a really strong investment appetite from individuals to invest in investment property, or to put their money into investment properties. And this is not without risk. This is not a risk-free strategy to own an investment property.
No.
So this was really good for tenants. They had choice, they had negotiating power. They could choose between, well, I like that, I don't like that, I'd like that, but could you put some air conditioning in? I'd like that, but I'd like ceiling fans. I'd like that, but can I have 3 pets? So there was actually a lot of ability for a tenant to say, yeah, I've got a few things to choose from here. I'll pay that for that, and I'll pay that for that. So there was a bit of bargaining and negotiating able to happen. But as the mix in the residential property market, there was some people that felt like there was too many investors actually buying investment properties, and it scared some of the folks out there, whether it be at a legislative level or a regulatory level. And you mentioned, Veronica, APRA, so the financial regulator, they stepped in after the Royal Commission and put a lid on investment property lending. So what they said to the lenders was, you can lend to investors, but we're only going to let you lend 10% of your total pool to investors. So they put a cap on it. They also said, you can lend to investors, but you can't discount the interest rate anymore as you could be for. So investors were stuck with whatever the variable rate was at the time. And they also said, by the way, don't let investors have interest-only loans. We've got to pay the principal off. So there was a reason that they had this response. We're not going to go into it. We're not analytical like that. You can probably reel it off the top of your head, but there's a reason that these things are brought into place, and that was put a cap on investment spending so that the mix went back to owner-occupiers. So owner-occupiers
I will throw in something. There's been there's this sort of equilibrium, this sort of numbers that is commonly accepted as the right balance, right? So 70% owner-occupier and 30% investor. So that's sort of been the general split that, the powers that be seem to be happy with in terms of ownership split, right? So I guess if you go back up to the total percentage of those who rent being 32% of people who rent,
yep.
I guess that sort of fits in nicely with that. What was happening was that balance was tipping in terms of new borrowing was way in excess of the 30% that was seen to be an acceptable proportion of new funds going into property or new borrowing going into property it was exceeding the 30%. And APRA was worried about the sustainability of property market, amongst other things. And then there was it was a perfect storm.
Responsible lending and...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If it hadn't happened at exactly the same time as the Royal Commission, that potentially the restrictions wouldn't have bitten quite so hard, because the banks sort of then went over cautious and really tightened up. And so you had the situation where investors might have been buying in any one area, maybe up to 50% of buyers might have been investors at one point. That then shrunk down to 5% in some places. So it's a massive contraction of one segment of the market. And if investors are then selling out and no investors are buying back in, then your overall balance is, you can, like you're saying, this is starting to see the setup for why we've got a shortage now.
So this is just step one almost. All those other steps.
The very beginning.
But what that did was it contracted. It meant there were less investors buying investment properties to put into the pool for tenants to rent. Now, at the time, we have always run on about, for our client base from a buyer's agency point of view with Property Pursuit, has always been about 45% investors and 55% owner-occupiers. So we dropped down to about 25% investors during this period. So without dropping overall client numbers, it actually encouraged owner-occupier spending. So there was a method there that actually achieved an outcome. And at the same time, and I'll talk Brisbane prices, Brisbane prices were actually decreasing on the decrease. So we're on a decline at that point in time. It did take a percentage of the pool, the buying pool out. So it had an effect on prices. We're not talking prices, we're talking rentals. So in 2019, so we've got a lessening. So we're on the rise. We've got a lessening of investors coming in and bringing new investment properties in. So we had a federal election in 2019, and there was two very different approaches to the campaign in terms of properties. Labor wanted to scrap negative gearing, which is one of the benefits that property investors have in owning a property that doesn't produce a positive income. So they're paying more than they actually earn from the property. So there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, and what will it mean? And, so people sat on their hands. They always do with the federal election, whether owner occupiers or investors. People sit on their hands just to wait to see what happens. But the coalition, of course, was elected, and they changed some of the benefits of investment ownership. So particularly in relation to depreciation.
Well, they actually did this before the election. They changed the depreciation.
You bought in, So everyone was focused on the scrapping of negative gearing, but then this all came through around the same time.
Yeah. And so basically what they were trying to do was to say that unless you bought brand new, which, we don't love, and so they do the same thing to investors that they do to first home buyers. They give investors more incentives to buy brand new property than existing stock, right? Yet the reality is there's a lot more existing stock out there than there is brand new property. And so you could have two apartments side by side. One of them is brand new, literally finished, and the other one was finished last year, but looks exactly the same, but somebody has bought it and only owned it for a year and then sold it, right? So in the oven, in that one's a year old. The oven in the brand new one's brand new, never been used. The person who buys a brand new one gets to depreciate the full value of the oven and the bath and the blinds and everything else, right? Person who buys the 1-year-old one doesn't get to depreciate any of those things, even though they might have 9 years working life left in them, right? Because of this change to the depreciation rule, right? And it's smart. You might be thinking first home buyers, who gives a shit? So what, investors? Whatever. But the fact is that it really took a lot of people out of, if they were buying for tax reasons, which is a whole other issue and is a really bad reason to buy a property. But if they were buying for that reason, they're not going to be buying the older stuff.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't buy for tax reasons, but what the depreciation allows them to do is actually sort of add to, at the end of the tax year, there's less of a loss.
Yeah. So if they sat down and did the numbers, it's not as attractive.
That's right. So this happened in 2019-ish. So again, these changes were a negative to property investment. It was a bit of a setting back of, oh, do I really want to take the risk? There is risk in owning an investment property. You put a lot of money into it and there's a lot of costs involved. So do I really want to do this? No, a lot of people said, no, I don't want to do this. Again, we saw less investors in our client mix in 2019, and I think the lending figures would probably support that compared to previous years. Now, going into 2020, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty. The brakes went on. We didn't know what was happening. It was such a period of strong growth, particularly in Brisbane leading up to that period of time, that late 2019 coming into January, February, March, it was absolutely firing. The demand was strong, prices were growing, and then boom, the bum fell out of the world. And we all sat back and there was a huge amount of fear and uncertainty. And from an investor point of view, and you know what? A lot of investors treated tenants with the utmost compassion when they lost their jobs. They couldn't pay their rents. There was rent abatement renegotiations and discounts. And I remember owners coming to me as a property management firm and saying, if there's anything that I can do to help my tenants, please let me know. I'm in a position where I'm okay. If they need help, I can help them. Others coming to me and saying, Megan, I've lost my job. I don't know what I can do to help. But we're all in this together. So it was a period of absolute compassion. But from an investor point of view, and remember, investors are there to make money at the end of the day, and the vehicle that they're using is residential investment property. So there was a loss of income during that period, but there was also quite a big loss of values as well. Do you remember that period?
Oh, God. So I've got 2 properties that came up that, like, as in the tenants moved out during that time. The first one, just pure bad timing. They had happened to buy a property in Perth just before lockdown, and literally they had to move over there in the middle of lockdown. Would have been a nightmare. They'd been great tenants, and that was just shocking timing, probably for them and for me. And it was really difficult to find. That was for a house, and it was really difficult to find another tenant. This was the beginning of the first lockdown. It was not the applications were not good, as in the type of people generally looking to rent at the time weren't your classic good tenant. And also the rent fell through the floor. So I'm on my second lot of tenants since then. So I know I used to have tenants for long periods of time. These current tenants are great. But can I tell you, the rent is $200 a week less. At its peak, I used to get $750 a week for this house. And these people are getting $550 a week at the moment. Look, that's massively under rent now because, of course, rents have started to rise. And then also same deal with my tenant. I've got a little apartment down in Bondi Beach, and I actually met with that tenant, had a look at the property a couple of months ago, and I said to her, you realise how cheap your rent is, don't you? Because same deal, she's paying a lot less, but she went hardball in terms of what she wanted to pay, and I didn't have much choice.
Didn't have choice at the time.
No.
Yeah.
So
and that was the interesting period of time, was if you could get someone to apply for the property, they had so much choice that they could be really quite hardball in the negotiations.
Yeah. And, and good luck to them at the time. I was happy to have it rented out. And also I've got 2 very good tenants now, which is, and look, that little apartment in Bondi Beach, I've always had amazing tenants on that, by the way. But I think that what's interesting now, though, because what happens when rents start rising, the landlords don't immediately feel that. So I have not felt rising rents for those 2 properties because I haven't received any increased rent yet, you know, because
Because
they're
you're
on
in
a
a
lease.
lease.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So this isn't an immediate bonanza for investors when rents start to increase. It's only the properties that come towards the end of their lease and there's a turnover in tenants, or potentially a lease renewal where there might be a renegotiation of the rate.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but what's been interesting though, I remember you talking to me about what was becoming really scarce, and that was family homes up in Brisbane. And I really honestly, and then every time you'd say something to me, and then about a month later, I think, oh, it's starting to happen down here. You know, that people were moving back from overseas and who had previously rented out their places, and that place was no longer available. Then, of course, you've got a migration of people coming from other states.
Oh, we're going to talk about demand in a moment, but let's keep pushing through supply.
Sorry.
That's okay, because your mind is going and we're getting there.
Race.
So late 2020, things started to look a little bit more positive. Prices increased, so house prices increased, and many tired investors, the ones that had really been bashed about, took the opportunity to cash out of the market with a really good price. And that, of course, led to less investment properties in the market. So look at the trend that we're seeing here. There's year-on-year factors that are actually pushing private investors out of the marketplace. And remember, private investors, what was my number, Veronica? What was the
28%?
26%, I think
26%,
it was.
sorry.
So they supply 26%, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
Of all households in Australia. So we're going down, down, down. The supply of these properties is actually going down. So let's have a look now at where we are at the moment. In 2022, investors have returned, but they're still not at the rate that is needed to satisfy demand. And this demand is going through the roof. Now,
I have to add another thing in. Oh, you're going to talk about this?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the notes as you're talking, just for anyone listening. I was going to add in something that Megan's about to tell you, so I'll just shut up.
So the borders have opened up and tourism is resuming, and properties that were put into the long-term rental pool during lockdowns are now being taken back out in Airbnb.
Well, they were taken out last year. They're not now being taken out. This has actually been a problem in the regional. It's really at the regional areas, and with increased domestic travel, that a lot of people that would not have even thought about short-term rental are now changing their rental property from the short-term market into long-term into the short-term. Another shortage. Some of those regional stories are awful. I've been hearing stories of families with jobs. It's not even like these people are on welfare. You know, they've got jobs, they've got kids. The kids are in schools and everything, and they're having to move 60 kilometres away from their communities because of this tree change phenomena.
And this is what we're saying. This isn't a media beat up. They are actually reporting what we are seeing on the ground. This is one of the real stories that isn't actually being over-exaggerated. This actually is happening. Yes. It actually is happening. And what we need to do is make sure we learn from what has led up to this. So let's keep going with the supply side of things. So a lot of states are actually now making, and they were leading into COVID, looking at making significant changes to their tenancy legislations. And a lot of that really isn't palatable to investors. You know, some of the things we've seen, Veronica, are, not being able to end a tenancy unless there's 3 or 4 basic, they're not even basic, they're significant reasons. Well, and this is the end of a tenancy, not end of a lease, not during a lease.
Yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, because I think one of the things you were talking about there is not being able to require somebody's outside of a lease to vacate without grounds. And it's so if I decide I want to sell my investment property, or I want to move into it, or I want to do something else with it, then
there's basically 4 grounds. You can sell, move in yourself, family move in, or significant renovations. So that's kind of the basis of most of the changes the states are looking or have made.
Which at least that's, I think, fair. But the problem is, and I know what they're trying to do is provide stability for tenants, but when you create a situation which makes a mum and dad investor or an individual investor not feel that they have flexibility over their asset, then they might be less likely to either hold on to it or to buy one in the first place. And I think that's where you're going, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it also comes down to tenant behaviour, because if a tenant wants to take advantage of the legislation, then they can do that. And there's no grounds for an owner to say, you know what, this has just been too hard. I can't keep doing this. An example is a tenant who continually pays in arrears but never actually is at the point where they're breached to the point of having to leave the property. But what that does to an investor's cash flow is it makes it very difficult for them to budget for paying mortgages and rates and maintenance and all of those sorts of things. So when someone isn't paying in accordance with their contractual requirements, which is the lease, but they keep pushing it to the point where they can't actually be put out of the property, but it has an impact on the owner used to be able to say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I need someone who will pay their rent on time, and that's going to be removed.
Mm. And let's face it, if you've got a shortage of rental properties and you find yourself with a tenant that's really not the most ideal tenant, then you're going to want to get rid of them and put someone in who
looks after the property.
Yes. There's enough demand out there. There's someone
looks
wanting
after it, is respectful in the process. Like that's what we want on both sides of the equation. When a tenant is respectful and owner is respectful, it's a really great relationship, and it goes a long way to a very happy, livable home. When you put pressure on one side or the other to perform a certain way, which isn't positive to the other party, then that's where friction and conflict can come up, and it will, because owners will look for reasons.
And look, that's not to say there's not some unscrupulous slumlord landlords out there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And like everything, most tenants are great. Most landlords are great. There's the exceptions to the rule. You don't want legislation to be legislating for the exceptions.
Yes,
really,
the old cricket bat to swat a fly, which we've seen in the industry too many times. So but for some, the decision around these legislative changes have meant that they've said too hard. Yeah. I'm going to move my money somewhere else. The risk of owning this property and what I have to take on and my outgoings don't weigh up against the risk of the legislative changes and what I might have to do or may not be able to do that I thought I could do. So overall, big picture, supply has dropped. And that's the exception is new units. We're not talking about those because we're putting those into a different basket. We're talking about what families want to live in generally from a supply point of view.
Which is sort of interesting because, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but suddenly it just occurred to me the build-to-rent sector has created this perfect storm.
Well, let's get to that in a minute, Veronica.
I'm only tongue-in-cheek here, guys, tongue-in-cheek.
It may be part of the solution if it's
sure
done
it is,
well.
Yeah.
Let's get to it. Let's look at demand. So number one thing, people aren't leaving Australia.
Mm-hmm.
We used to have this exodus of people who sort of looked at business opportunities, work opportunities, career opportunities, living opportunities, cultural opportunities to actually leave our shores and work overseas. That used to be a really, really big part of the net demand equation because there was people leaving, there was people coming in. But we've got all of this influx of people coming back to the country. Expats are coming back because it's safe. We've got good healthcare here. Our economy's doing okay. I know, inflation, all those other things. But realistically, in the bigger scheme of things, you're not in a country where someone's going to come and take you at midnight from your home and put you in isolation for 21 days if you test positive. That is not the environment we're in. We're not at war. So it is actually very safe, and people have access to healthcare. In other places, I remember those visions of people in countries waiting to get into a hospital, and they were bringing oxygen tanks out to them, and we have a ambulance ramping problem, we've got a healthcare system problem, but it's not, people aren't dying in the street outside the hospital in their hundreds. So overall, the decision of expats, Australians who have been living overseas, has been to come home. So we've got this net influx of people. We haven't got an exodus of people as we used to have. And Veronica, households are multiplying. people were staying home for a number of years. People were living at home to take advantage of the opportunity to save. But now it's like, oh, geez, I just spent lockdown with the family. I think I need to go and find my own place.
We just actually literally just were hearing about this recently that, that the whole share house sort of broke up with lockdowns.
Yes.
I do not want to be locked up with these randoms in my share house.
Yeah, take me home. Mum's going to look after me and cook for me.
Yeah, and now I'm a bit sick of mum and dad just quietly trying to tell me how to live my life, and I want to go back out there. And so there's this sort of, coupling up as you meet someone, right, now's it, time to go and rent somewhere. So the actual apartments in Sydney anyway, because the inner city apartment has been slumped. And so we talk about a rental crisis in most areas of family homes. There's been a saturation of 2-bedroom and 1-bedroom units in Sydney for quite some time, but all of a sudden there's demand for those have gone up. So it's
with the share houses.
Yeah. Well, it's the change in behaviour. But also we haven't yet had immigration ramp back up again, and that's all back being talked about in political circles, and we've got a labour supply problem.
We absolutely need professionals to come, but where are we going to put them?
Exactly. Well, they can go in all those 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom apartments in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. But the problem is, of course, what about those that come out with families?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got some external supply factors that are going to start to hit us to actually address some of the labour shortages that we have in some professional fields.
And the construction field, just quietly.
Construction, so even hospitality. I have to tell you, I don't walk past any cafes, coffee shops, pubs that don't have signs saying need front of house staff, that still I think is undersupplied as people went to other areas. I'd love to see wouldn't it be interesting to do some research on the labour market at the moment, because I think the whole mix has changed significantly. But anyway, I digress.
I've spoken to a number of people in hospitality, and sometimes they've actually had to close for shifts because they haven't had staff.
Yes, but can't do lunch today because we don't have lunch. Red Rooster. I went to Red Rooster with the kids the other day. It was closed because they could not get staff.
Oh wow! So they've got these apps now, so you don't need a waiter because you can actually just scan it with a QR code on your phone and do all your ordering from the table. And that's sort of one of those contactless things that came in through COVID, but it's stuck around in many places because we can't afford the staff to take your order. So therefore, that'll do just nicely.
Yeah.
Thanks. I know we're not really talking about first home buyers here, but you guys are tenants, right?
But some people are rent investors as well, and they're tenants at the moment trying to work out how to get into the market. And this is a part of the big picture. And when you're a first home buyer, you have to understand the big picture and how the big picture affects your ability to get into the market. So it all does sort of fall into place. But it's really the perfect storm. So we've got the decrease in supply and the increase in demand, and it's bloody heartbreaking to watch. It is, even as a property management firm, to get 15, 20 applications on a property and have every one of those applicants ringing up begging to be the successful applicant is heartbreaking.
It's just awful. And I just think as having a young family and just staring down the barrel of potentially not having a home.
Where do I live?
Kids.
Yeah. How do I look after these children? There was an article came out today. We're recording this on the 8th of June. An article came out today saying there's up to 50,000 people who are in crisis. They actually have nowhere to go. Either their property's been sold and they need to vacate, and that's real. That's happening. And most of those properties are being bought by first home buyers or upgraders, not investors.
You've got something that's contributed to the problem of lack of supply: floods and bushfires.
Good point. I have actually, because I actually had notes on that somewhere. I wonder why I didn't say it. So we've got, flooding, bushfires, lack of tradies. So there are some properties that have had leaky roofs with the weather. So this amount of rain that has been around, when those properties become mouldy, and there's a massive mould problem everywhere at the moment in southeast Queensland. I don't know what Sydney's doing, but God, it is phenomenal. And that all of those sorts of things can lead to a property not being able to be inhabited. Yeah, good point.
So it's just, one thing after another. It's quite bizarre, so many times, particularly on the elephant in the room, it's just different people we've interviewed. There's your dogs, different people that we've interviewed, over various disciplines, and each and every time it's like this, COVID's brought around acceleration of 10 years of change into 1 year or 2 years. Certainly this housing situation in Australia and the housing affordability, it is well and truly beyond just helping first home buyers get into the market. This is about having everybody with that basic human right of secure housing.
Yeah.
We do have an absolute crisis. I think the word crisis is misused a lot in this country, and so we've all become a bit desensitized to it. But we do have a crisis in this area.
There's no doubt. Yeah, and you and I are on the same page about that. Sometimes we can debate and have different opinions, and we come from different states and all that sort of thing. But I think for this one, Veronica, I don't think the media is overplaying it. I don't think they're overstating it. I don't think they're reaching for a headline. This is actually happening, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it on the ground. We're seeing people who, and so the solution is not easy. There's no quick and easy solution to this.
I think the word there is quick. There is no quick solution. If you think about it, how long does it take to build or construct property? It takes a long time to construct any habitation. A house takes
anything habitable is
months,
whether
months,
it's
months.
units or townhouses or houses, or
and that's just when you've hit first nail. It's the planning, the just everything. There's just a huge long supply chain, and then we've got supply chain issues and. We talked about staffing issues, but we've got a real issue with rising construction costs.
Absolutely.
And just a lack of stuff to build from.
And people who are part of it. I saw that to get an engineer to do plans for a renovation or a new build has pushed out 4 months. That's just the engineer.
Yeah.
That's not even getting it through, the whole approval process.
So this isn't going to get solved quickly. And then you've got people living in caravans and tents. And it's just,
and cars.
Yeah. Mortifying.
That's yeah. So some of the options that need to be explored, and you and I are not going to solve this here, but I think what we want to do is open up people's thinking to the bigger picture. It's not just about the fact that rents are rising. There's a whole lot of factors that have led to this. And so the solution to it isn't small, quick, easy, or a single dart that's going to pop the balloon. There's actually so many things that have gone into how it's happened, and there are so many things that need to be looked at, because unintended consequences are the biggest thing that wreck property markets. They wreck a lot of things, but you can think, let's go down this path, but what are the unintended consequences that actually the effect of reining in investor activity was, there's less supply of investment properties. Let's get more people to buy properties. Not everyone can buy a property. Not everyone's in a position to or wants to buy a property. There are just going to be people who rent. So the unintended consequence has been a narrowing of the options for renters, to the point, you take into account weather, as you said, economic factors, appetite for investment, returns, all those sorts of things. There's so many factors that go into whether someone wants to invest in the private residential property market and therefore supply more housing to tenants.
And now you've got interest rates going up, which you might think means investors won't want to get involved. But the bizarre thing is that the tax benefits of investing in property have been less because of really low interest rates. And it does mean you've got to lose money to make money. And what I mean by that is, for every dollar you lose, you might get, I don't know, what's some
42,
37 or something.
37 to 42 or something.
So that maths doesn't add up.
And remember, most property investors aren't on the highest tax bracket.
No.
They're not. They're not high income earners. They are day-to-day people with jobs who have made a decision to sacrifice some money to invest for their long-term future, which actually provides housing for people in the short term. So we're not talking about people that are on the highest tax bracket necessarily. They could be in that second or third tier below.
Yeah, I just saw some data today, quite interesting, around about the makeup of basically who is owning our investment properties in this country. And the proportion of people owning more two as opposed to one has actually increased a little bit, interestingly enough. But the value of those investment properties. So the average value, 28% value between 250 and 500,000, and 21% between 500 and 750,000. And then it sort of goes down from there. So the bulk of Australians owning investment properties, they're not big cats, you know what I mean? They're not owning massively expensive properties. They're sitting somewhere between, so it's 49%, so it's nearly half, is value between 250 and 750,000.
That's interesting. And actually, most investors only own one property.
68% own one. That's the latest stats. It used to be 71%, 72%. And only 4% own 4 or more.
Yeah. So we're not talking big end of town here that provide our housing,
this
our
is
rental
one of my
housing.
big bugbears against Labor's negative gearing policy back in 2019, because they get on Bill Shorten and what's his name used to get on and go, oh, why should some fat cat be able to get their 6th investment property when poor battlers are not being able to afford to buy their first home? It's like, if you just look here, the stats are 4 or more properties are owned by only 4% of investors. Tiny segment.
Teeny tiny. Yeah,
and
the biggest amount of supply.
But 80% of the people that were using negative gearing were in the lowest income bracket.
Yep.
So
that's something we need to understand, because it's not an us and them. It's this whole us and them mentality around tenants and property investors. We've got to reframe that and rethink it, because if there aren't enough of those people who want to own an investment property, just every day, hardworking, earn their income, decide that's an investment strategy they want to pursue, and they sacrifice for it, then you can't keep pushing those people out of the marketplace, because who's going to replace them?
Well,
let's talk about that. Let's talk about the options.
Who is going to replace them? Well,
yeah. We need things that encourage investor activity, and I don't mean like ridiculous incentives. And we don't want these first home buyer type incentives that encourage investors to get into new properties, because they aren't good investment strategies and they're not what tenants want. So we have to have housing that tenants want. We need something that goes, we're back up to, in our business, we're back up to 35% investors as opposed to owner occupiers. But it's a long way to go back to where we were, to get that balance. But we're a long way off where we need to be in terms of having the right amount of supply. So there has to be some really hard looks at encouraging investor activity, but understanding the consequences, unintended and intentional, of what those sorts of legislative or incentive based or what it is that we're doing.
I think what's interesting though, in a typical year, there's 100,000 first home buyers. The last couple of years, I think it's been 160,000. That's been because of increased government incentives. There was a home builder program, and also I think the home loan guarantee that were really quite effective in bringing forward a lot of first home buyers. So you guys might think it's hard to buy your first home, and it is, but 60,000 people extra bought their first home last year than was expected fundamentally. So it's not impossible, clearly, otherwise people wouldn't be doing it. But if you look at the proportion, there are 2.6 million renting. It's a much bigger proportion of the total population than every year the first home buyer proportion. So, and I know a big argument against encouraging investors in the market is that, but they're taking property away from first home buyers. And I think there's got to be better ways for governments to actually help first home buyers at the same time as not discouraging investors. You know what I mean? There needs to be cleverer ways to go about that than what's been suggested, and certainly what's been done in the past. And there is a whole new segment of the market that is very much underway, and it'll be quite a game changer, I think, once these build to rent complexes start hitting the market. But they've got to have the right type of properties in them as well.
Yeah.
They can't just be 2-bedroom apartments.
So let's talk about that build to rent, because that's a really interesting market. There's about 25,000 households in the pipeline at the moment in Australia that are specifically build to rent. Now it's a 5-year pipeline, so it's not going to happen overnight. But that's a significant supply. But a lot of these are sort of oriented around community, culture, amenities. So they're not actually, your entry level rental type places. They're actually aimed more at people who have a little bit more discretionary income to spend on their rent. So it's going to potentially be aimed at some of those longer term renters or people who want a lifestyle aspect, not necessarily a house. So not necessarily family, but perhaps, couples, singles, share household and so forth. These kinds of things might allow basic modifications. They might allow pets. But the big thing about rent to buy, and we're not advocating that this is the answer to anything. It's just one of an array of solutions with a lot of risk management over the top.
Build to rent, not rent to buy.
Rent to buy. Build to rent.
Build to rent. Terms,
you're the one that's got fog brain, not me.
I know. Can't believe I'm right on it.
Quite well. But the thing is that they have the security of longer leases. So when you've got an investor, if their circumstances change, they might need to sell a property, or if their job changes, or they move overseas, or there's a parting of the ways of a partnership. These things can all lead to changes for the tenant. Whereas these ones that are really built just to be rentals, you can be there as long as you're paying the rent and so forth, and doing your tenancy right, and looking after the property and so forth. They're not selling these things next year. They're long term. Yeah. So it actually, on the positive side, gives some longevity to your ability to stay in a property if that's what your needs are. And I like that for people.
Also gives investors who might want another way to invest in property, in residential property, at a whole different investment class, really.
Yeah.
As well, there'd be investment trusts and various things that you could probably buy shares in. But I think too that honestly the governments have to actually step it up with more in the way of social housing. And I've been, over the years I've been not an advocate for too much social housing, mainly because my observation, having lived quite close to quite a lot of it many times, is, teach a man to fish, fish for a day. Was it fish? Feed a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, and he'll fish forever, eat forever. Oh, God, I'm in total fog brain now. And which is slightly paternalistic and arrogant of me, to be quite frank, to say that. But at the same time, I don't think that giving people anything without the tools and the support to actually build themselves out of a situation, I don't think it's good for society. So, but we have to look after those who can't look after themselves. We do, and then we have to look after the people that can't put a roof over their kids' heads. Like it's just not. It's not a right society that actually lets families live in tents. I just don't think it is.
Yeah. Which was never the intention. And we're certainly not suggesting that was, that was never the intention of any sort of policy or decision making along the way.
No, but it's created a hole.
It's a storm of things that came on top of some of those bad decisions: weather, climate, circumstances, COVID, pandemic, all those sorts of things contributed. But there are other things that need to be looked at, whether there's incentives to get empty nesters into smaller homes or apartments, and that frees up some supply that is in the family space, or looking at stamp duties, transfer duty. It's one of the biggest barriers to entry for first home buyers and investors is how much they've got to actually stump up front.
I think this is a problem, is that in the investors, if you already, and this is the secret, guys, once you get your first home and you buy one that actually goes up in value, which is why you're listening to this podcast, not going out there just money from the government. So you get an asset that goes up in value, you see equity growing, which is amazing, right? That's wonderful. It's just magic, right? Then you have enough of that, then you can actually go and borrow against that equity and go and buy an investment property and start building your property wealth empire, right? This is the holy grail. I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is this is really how it works. And so an investor that's not a rent investor, not buying their first property as an investment property, they are not stumping up stamp duty. They're borrowing that money because they've got equity in their home. They're digging into that. So technically they're not saving up any more money. Once you've saved up that first deposit and you've made the good decision to buy a really good asset, then the rest of your life, as long as you've got a good income, is sorted.
And I love that. And your passion is amazing. But the fact is, I still think it is something that state governments have to look at, because that barrier to entry is high and it is a large outlay for investors to make, as opposed to some of the concessions that are offered to owner occupiers. So I think it does need to be looked at.
It needs to be looked at in terms of major tax reform. There's no doubt about it. My personal jury is out as to whether that's going to free up supply, because it also reduces the barrier to entry. So, is it going to bring more stock on the market, and that's going to make life easier, and therefore more investors are going to, it takes away that barrier. And I know I'm just confusing. Actually, COVID brain has just totally hit me.
Because I'm just here because we're debating something that remember, let's cut this. Go back to pre this, because it's a good argument. But what we're saying in this section, Veronica, is these are things that can be looked at, not why they should or why they shouldn't, these are some of the things that can be looked at.
Sorry, editor, cut that whole ramble of mine. I'm not even going to replace it with anything.
So let's go back to another thing that can be looked at is stamp duty. Ready? So another area that can actually be looked at is stamp duty or transfer duty, because this is a really high barrier to entry, and there is a difference between what investors pay and what owner occupiers pay in terms of the concession. So it is something that I think state by state is one of the areas, as part of a bigger solution, that should be examined. And you and I can debate and will debate what that might look like. But it is part of a bigger solution, I think. And look at interest rates. Look at interest rates. At the moment, institutions can't offer a discount off the standard variable advertised interest rate to investors. And I still don't think you can get an interest-only loan for investment, can you?
I think you can, but they're quite tight in terms of how long. I think, look, the problem is that, of course, investors are being set up to be, the evil landlord and rule us and them sort of mentality. It's like, and I don't think that's helpful to the debate either.
I don't think it is either.
Yeah, I think
now we're seeing the outcome, the impact of putting the brakes on investment.
Yeah,
and it's actually the tenant that is suffering.
Yeah, and I think that really pulls this entire episode to its critical point. It's the people that are suffering here are people who can't find somewhere to rent, at a reasonable price.
Yep.
And it's appalling. And probably it's impacting some of the listeners as well, because you guys are trying to save money to buy a home in a world of increasing rents. It's not great. It
has an impact on that savings capability.
So this episode isn't so much to provide any real solutions for you guys. We just hope you don't mind our ramblings on this.
Yeah, but to understand how this all come into effect, and there always needs to be a balance, a really delicate balance between encouraging investment and the needs of owner occupiers and first home buyers. There has to be that balance, because there are all parts of the property market. You can't just legislate or advocate for one section of the market without understanding the impact that it has on other sections of the market. And I think that's it, but it needs to be pursued for the net benefit of people having a home to live in that they can afford. And we're not talking about being able to, live on Bondi Beach and have a gorgeous outlet. We're talking about the basics of being able to house your family close to a school that your children go to, or close enough to your workplace that you can commute, or close enough to your elderly family members that you may have to care for. These are the basics that we're talking about, and it is as much about the supply side of the equation as it is about the demand side of the equation. And right now, both of those things are working terribly in opposition to each other to create an undersupply and an over demand.
And what it does at the absolute end of the day, it really just underpins why it's so important that if you can buy yourself your own home, that is the greatest way to give yourself that security. And, you know, I know you don't need us to tell you that, and I don't want to come across self-interested in saying that even. It's just a bit of a fact.
In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first-time buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.